So today the presentation is going to be on ethics concerning AI, facial recognition, and other emerging technologies. And here's how it's going to go. We're going to start with a video. It's like an 8-minute video. I don't know if you guys want to watch that whole thing, but it is really good video. So then we're going to talk about what is ethics, ethics concerns with emerging technologies. So we're going to talk about AI, facial recognition, some of those concerns. We're going to go through, examples and stuff that's actually happening and then happening. And then we're going to think about what we should do, or what are the answers to these questions. Go ahead and feel free to interject if you disagree with something. I mean, this is an ethics presentation. Not everything's going to be black and white. Feel free to give examples or promote discussion on a certain topic. Interject with a question maybe. Conversation, debate are good. Okay.
So I thought that was a pretty good video. I think it really outlines kind of the roadmap we're going to follow in our presentation when we're looking into more specifically. Just for context, if you think about it, we've always had to consider the ethics of new technology. You think about nuclear technology, that was done with some success. Some would argue not much success, right? Because we still face certain threats from nuclear technology that, probably weren't foreseen in its development or weren't considered in its development. And then you think about the cotton gin. Cotton gin was an aid in prolonging the institution of slavery. The guy who created that, I guarantee you, he didn't consider the ethics of the creation of that technology, or he didn't care. Two things. So the important thing I want you guys to understand is that the failure to consider ethics is not an option, because there will always be real consequences with whatever you create, small or big. Okay, so what is ethics? That's a big question. And I'm just going to, I'm not an ethics professor. I can't explain to you exactly all the nuances, but I'm going to try to give you a general idea. Ethics is a framework of right and wrong. And so in that sense, it's gray, because we know everything's not right and wrong. Society's most prevalent ethical frameworks sorry for the typos, guys, have to do with the rights of people. So human rights is an ethical framework. It's a way of deciding how you should treat the world, people in the world, and then also extend it into how you should treat the world around us and the environment and other living organisms. Now, the goal of ethics, or the practice or the study of ethics, is to develop ethical standards by which to make decisions. And I don't know what could be more important, to have a way that you make decisions. Okay, so here's our main question. What are the ethical implications of certain emerging technologies? Now let's kind of think about what the video was saying. So we're going to go to the first kind of concern with the engineering of technologies like artificial intelligence and facial recognition, are two I'm kind of going to highlight today. So number one, the impact of biases. So you can look at biases have impact in one, the biases in the data. I think they kind of said it there. Naturally, I mean, if you took stats or if any type of research, the researcher is always asked to consider their ethical concerns relating to their own bias. And so if the data you collect is biased, then don't you think that the results that you're going to get is going to be biased? That's something researchers consider. And that principle kind of has to do with AI and facial recognition as well. And this is just somewhat of my personal commentary. I think we have an overwhelming trust in quantitative data. I think we have an overwhelming trust in that the numbers will tell us everything, but a lot about what you do is about how you get those numbers and what are the forces, the structures around it that are enforcing or creating those numbers. So I'm gonna try to keep this interesting.
So like the quality of the data, right?
Yeah, the quality data, exactly.
It's not just with AI though. It's like with almost anything that you do, the quality of the data. If it's not good data, then you're gonna get bad results and biased results. Like
And
Nikhil
that's
and
in
I saw the same
everything.
thing with detector building in Science Olympiad.
Yeah, and everyone here who does experimental design knows exactly how to manipulate the judges into thinking this is legit data when more times than not, it isn't legit data.
Okay. Yeah, so those are some really practical examples of that bias in that data is prevalent in all spaces, but it's really interesting how it plays out when you think about artificial intelligence facial recognition. So the main way bias in data plays out that's concerning is that it reinforces structural biases, and it also reinforces unconscious biases. So what is a structural bias? Humans are part of a system, so is technology. So a structural bias might have to do with, like they gave in the video, and I'm going to get to that example soon, the example of the criminal justice system. We know that the criminal justice system in America disproportionately has involved people who are black and brown, are disproportionately involved in our judicial system. Now, are they committing more crime, making more offenses? Not necessarily, but our system has certain biases that create that environment. And so if you insert technology into that environment and you don't consider the ethics of using that technology in that environment, you might just be reinforcing those already structural biases. And then also unconscious biases. Those are really important and they're harder to nail down. Those can also be reinforced by the creator, like they were saying. If they, it comes down to if the creator is flawed or has certain views, and that, is cast into the creation. So I want to give you guys an interesting example. And all my links, I'm going to share this with you. All the sources I use are in the speaker's notes. This was a really interesting, I got this from an article from ProPublica. They did a kind of investigative journalism piece about the use of risk factor algorithms in the criminal justice system. So basically in Florida, in some parts of Florida, they use this software that assigns a risk value to an offender about how likely they are to reoffend or commit violent crime. And there's some major problems that were not considered when developing and implementing this. So if you read the headline there, it says, these software are used around the country to predict future criminals, and it's biased against black. So
wait, so did they actually use the results from this software, or was it just?
Oh yeah, heck yeah. Judges in Florida actually use it to decide what kind of sentence they're going to give to people.
Oh, that's.
Isn't that troubling?
Yeah.
So if you take a look on the right there's a guy, his name is Burden Prater, and then there's a lady, her name is Barisha Borden. So this case that ProPublica pulled out, both of these people were convicted of petty theft of about $80 worth of merchandise. Okay? Barisha had no prior criminal record. Vernon Prater had armed robbery and several other violent offenses already on his record. They assigned a low risk score to Vernon and a high risk score to Barisha.
I think that's just terrible programming.
Yes, exactly. And I'll get into that kind of what tells that. It is that here's the reason why there was some problems with that? Why does it unfairly affect Black people, and specifically Black women, is what ProPublica kind of drags out in the article. So, number one, lack of transparency. Part of the problem is that not even the judges, not even the lawyers know how the systems were arriving at these conclusions. And so it was developed by a company called North Point, and they didn't really have to publicize what they used to come to these conclusions at all, or what their algorithms included. And so this kind of gets to the issue is, are algorithms proprietary information, and what should ethically corporations, companies, and creators of technology be required to release about their creation? And then but they actually did get some information out of them about what is behind the risk factor system. And so they use 137 questions, either answered by the criminal record or by the defendant themselves. And these are questions like, did you have a parent that went to jail but does not, that went to jail? But what this question fails to answer, and this is kind of called a data proxy, it doesn't ask anything about race right here. It does not ask anything about race. The word race is not in this sentence, right? Like, did you have a parent that went to jail? Nothing about race in there. But what it doesn't consider is the larger realities, the already biases in the system, like mass incarceration. And if you don't know what mass incarceration is, that is something that's going on in this country to this day, that disproportionately sentences and convicts Black people and puts them in jail at higher rates than white people who commit the same crimes. And so a question like that is a proxy for asking, or maybe it's a proxy for the question of race. In some ways it can be. Not necessarily all the time, but it can trend that way. And so this gets to a major question, which is asked in this article, and this is the whole frame of it, and I'll try to keep going here so you guys can bring in your thoughts. The question is about, what about due process? And this is what the lady was saying about transparency. If you don't know how you got to the point where it made this decision, how do you employ this technology? Any conclusion in the court of law and what due process necessitates is it must be allowed to be cross-examined and disputed. But this risk factor in the court of law is cited as evidence, not a conclusion or testimony. It is cited as evidence, and therefore it is taken more so at face value. Now, you can dispute the evidence, but it's much harder because they can't get into the nitty-gritty of why the algorithm came to the choice that it did. And that's a lack of transparency. What do you guys think about that specific case? I know, Zyad, you said that's just horrible programming, but I mean, these are the...
I think they should base it more on objective factors, such as, like, I don't know, maybe heart rate when they're like when they're asking them questions, or I don't know, or previous records for themselves, not for like their families. Like if they committed a crime beforehand, that might be a factor that you can take into account, because it's.
But here's the big question: is it right to have an algorithm decide how much a person, or try to predict how much a person is at risk, or
personally,
how much of a person is at risk?
I just feel like they applied it to the wrong. I don't feel like this should be applied to the judicial system. Like applying AI to rating people on the risk factor. I think that's
very
just
problematic.
Yeah.
And I feel like something like this that's used in government purpose, used for government purposes, should definitely be open source. Like it
Yep.
has to be.
They got to open source their data set, open source their algorithm, open source everything on this if the government's doing it.
Yep, but this company, North Point, has no accountability in that area. Florida has no laws that require them to publish that.
Yeah, so
is China's social credit system, is that judicial? Do they use that in the courts?
I'm gonna get to that. That's later in the presentation. I'm gonna get to it, Dylan. Okay, so now
Also,
let's talk about. So
Kai asked a question. He said, "Has there been a study done on how correct the algorithm is?"
Yeah, and the ProPublica actually they did their own data and their own number crunching on exactly how predictive it is. It is crazily bad. In this specific case, Barisha, she did not have any reoffenses on her record after they looked 2 years later. Vernon was sentenced to 8 years in jail for another offense, and he was actually, reoffended. And what they had is the article is linked, but they show that it's remarkably unpredictive.
dang.
Yeah. Okay. So then the video talked about bias. Now let's talk about transparency. So understanding how it works and arrives at its conclusions. And that kind of gets to what are the motivations. So this is kind of outlining what ethical transparency looks like, or what are the questions to consider. Transparency, why is transparency useful? You can spot both unintended consequences and malicious intent. And there's currently very little regulation about AI facial recognition algorithms concerning, what is considered intellectual property and not, and what needs to be transparently released, documented. And there's very little regulators or watchdogs who do this kind of review and watching out. So let me give you an example. And this one is not necessarily in the criminal justice system or for use by government, but this is for use by a private company, specifically Apple and Goldman Sachs. So how many of you guys know about the Apple Card? You can now sign up for Apple
and
credit
you
card.
can't put it in your wallet because the titanium somehow just rubs out.
Really? What? Really?
Yeah, there was this news story a while ago. Apparently they've fixed it, I think, but the first batch of them was like that.
So not only did they have bad hardware, but they had some problems with the software, which determined who got to get an Apple Card. And so there's been allegations that it is gender biased. And actually, Steve Wozniak has been like, oh yeah, this is bad. And here's where it really gets down to it. So Goldman Sachs ultimately was the one who administers the deciding who gets to get a card. And the Apple Card was marketed as a new way. Most people could get it. You didn't have to necessarily have great credit. And it was going to be a good credit card for you to get. No strings attached, right? But where they ran into a problem is they were accused of gender bias. And when they went to try to figure out what was up with it, not even they knew what went wrong. And this gets to not only the transparency idea, but not knowing how your own algorithm arrives at the decisions it does, or how your own, and it's actually used a massive amount of data. So big data used a massive amount of data to figure out who would be more likely to pay their credit card bill and such, and who would be a better candidate to have on your credit card or use your credit card. And so what they found out is that perhaps, and the investigation is still out on this, perhaps they had data proxies for females that said that females were less likely to be reliable customers. And they don't know exactly where that's at. partly because Goldman Sachs is refusing to release a lot of information on this. And so what they said in their defense was, there nowhere in our data set, nowhere in the algorithm does it have anything to do with gender. It doesn't even mention gender. It said it is gender blind. But here was the difficulty. Once again, we get to that is not a way to prevent bias, because you still have data proxies, and those were not necessarily accounted for or manipulated in the correct way. So that's another example. And that has more to do with transparency. That's why I classified it that way. And then we get to our last piece, and this is probably the most thought-provoking. And they all, in all the different aspects, so bias and transparency and, just the engineering of it, but also the implementation, they all kind of come to this. There's concerns that AI, facial recognition, have the possibility to infringe on human rights, privacy, and other civil liberties. And so when we think about biases and lack of transparency, they may lead to, as you saw in those two cases, discrimination, which is illegal and, also violates human rights. And then also violations of privacy. That's a big concern as well, with how artificial intelligence is being employed in some circumstances. And so then not only does it extend to these, what you would think is common sense concerns, but there's bigger concerns that you might not necessarily associate right away. So other human rights violations. One of a human right is, as declared by the UN, the right to decent work and employment. People are concerned, what does AI do with the possibility of employment? And shout out to Nikhil Murali. That's a big question. Do we employ or do we use AI in some of these circumstances, and what does it do to employment for people? How do you navigate that, and what is the ethical standards by which you decide whether that's a good choice or not? And then also there's concerns, like you heard in the video, about compounding inequality. There's a question, with the structural biases embedded in AI and massively used, does this just compound wealth inequality, compound race inequality, compound gender inequality? That's a big consideration. And so I don't want to, make this whole presentation doom and gloom and here's what's wrong and here's bad, because, the thing with ethics and ethical standards relating to AI, facial recognition, and these new technologies we're starting to develop more and more is that I believe, and many believe, companies and technology and government and lots of other people believe that if we employ the right ethical standards, then we can consider some of these big questions. So let me give you an example. I know you guys know a lot about China's social credit system, their implementations of mass surveillance, but I wanted to draw attention to one specific use of facial recognition. And they're using it specifically, one way is to identify Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang province. I don't know if you guys know much about what's going on there, but the Chinese have, and I'll be brief with it, the Chinese have massive, practically concentration camps, but I think they call them re-education camps. And they are finding a lot of these Uyghur families and people through the use of massive surveillance and facial recognition technology to isolate them. And so the question is, this is not an unintended consequence, but this facial recognition technology is working as intended. And so the ethical question here is, what happens when emerging technologies fall into the hands or are developed for malicious ends? What do you do about that? I'm gonna leave that one to, sit on the brain and think a little bit. But it's not all doom and gloom.
Isn't it already
What?
being used for malicious uses?
Yeah. And in the future, the question is, what do you do about that?
Well, we as Americans can't do much to change the Chinese government.
I want you to more think about from the perspective of being a somebody who works in the tech field, somebody who is an engineer, software engineer, somebody who does deals with artificial intelligence. What are you personally? What can you do about this? All right, so I'm going to continue, but I want you to know it's not all doom and gloom. Meeting ethical standards is crucial when you're developing something. You have to consider those questions, like what biases is this? Am I developing this in a transparent fashion? And is this serving is this achieving what I wanted it to? And is it doing it in an ethical way? But not only can you have, and I think you guys know this, so I guess I'm just preaching to the choir. Not only can you have ethical development, but you can have development that protects human rights as well. And so I wanted to give you a few examples of ways that AI in facial recognition and big data is being employed in order to protect human rights. So to protect the right of education, online resources, or expanding access. And then also I read an interesting article about there's an NGO who's in a company who are partnering together to use gamification and cognitive development research to develop algorithms that adjust and kind of can autonomously help a child learn, which is really interesting. We might have virtual teachers sooner than we think. Also, another example is the identification of violations of human rights. So I believe the UN Commission or Human Rights Agency Commission, I can't remember which one it is, are analyzing social media feeds and places of purported human rights violations, and also large sets of environmental and migration data in order to understand better what is the situation. One place they've used this already is in Venezuela.
Nice.
Say again?
That's nice.
And then also the Internet of Things is being used to help ensure ethical standards on supply chains. You think about how you get your Apple Watch. They're using Internet of Things to track, how is this being manufactured? Is it, are we doing this in an ethical way that meets our highest ethical standards along such a distributed supply chain globally? So there is ways that technology, like they said, can be used to solve our biggest challenges. But we also have to consider the ethics, even when that's not the goal, or when that is. So what's the answer? Is what I'm kind of get to. I'll get to a more reflective part of the presentation where I really want you to think, what is the answer and what can you do? And so I just want to give an example of the use of ethical standards. Microsoft just adopted fairly recently facial recognition principles. You can see them there. And I have a link in the speaker's notes if you want to know more detail about what each of these entails. But I know it seems pretty broad, but they want to employ fairness, transparency, accountability, non-discrimination, notice and consent, and lawful surveillance. So what they're trying to do is anybody who works for Microsoft, any technology is given to a Microsoft client, they want to make sure that when they're using facial recognition, they want to make sure that they're applying by these ethical standards that they've established. Considering that question and making sure their employees, making sure that their clients are held accountable for abiding by these standards. Okay. So this kind of gets to me. So I really hope that if you choose to pursue a career in technology, you will, one, have to take at least one ethics course in college. I believe most colleges, if you're a computer science major, even if you're an engineering major, especially if you're a medical major, require you to take an ethics course. But I hope that you have to, or that you choose to. And then number two, I hope that you obtain further ethics training once you enter the workforce and decide to do whatever. And then, you have to, I don't believe right now there's many certifications on it, but I hope that in the future people are required to obtain more certification. And like it said in the videos, and it's widely embraced, the idea that this problem is just out there, it's really important to consider how do you solve the problem of people not considering the ethical impact or the social impact of developing certain technologies or their unintended consequences. This problem starts in the classroom, so that's where it really, I'm hoping today that I've kind of put a brain bug in you, that you really think about this in the future and challenge others to think about you and whatever your career choice or path forward is. I just want to get a few things. So what is the broader answer besides your own training and your own consideration? Regulation. So regulation is, and I want to kind of give the difference between regulation and policy. Regulation is what is prohibited. Meaningful regulation puts in safeguards that align with an ethical framework. So a regulated industry is like banking. They try to regulate banks to do things that are ethical with people's money and how they choose who gets money and who doesn't. But it's important with regulation to provide the balance where you don't stunt innovation. And so that's just a kind of a broader conversation. It's really raging right now. What's regulation for AI and facial recognition, especially in the judicial system, also in the financial service industry, and a lot of other parts of our economy and our everyday lives. And then you get to policy, what is encouraged and what is incentivized. So are we incentivizing people to make people's lives better through the use of AI? Or are you incentivizing people to make a quick buck or something more malicious like exacerbate inequality? What are we incentivizing people? That comes down to what policy is written. And then do we reward ethical behavior? And so the kind of difference between regulation and policy, a lot of times you tend to think, well, regulation is not good if you're trying to develop technology, trying to be innovative. But it's also about what incentives are in place at a governmental level, even at a company level, that encourage and give money to and reward and support the development of ethical technologies, specifically in artificial intelligence and facial recognition. So whether you're the next regulator or lawmaker, engineer concerned with developing artificial intelligence facial recognition, whether you choose to somewhere in your career that contacts you, or whether you're the founder of a tech ethics firm that audits algorithms to try to reduce unethical practices and isolate biases and manipulate them and such. If maybe that's your career, maybe that's your moneymaker, maybe that's your future aspirations and passions, I really hope that you take into ethical considerations and kind of think back to this presentation and say, does this fit with ethical standards that, don't violate human rights, privacy, or other civil liberties? Is there biases? Is this developed and implemented in a transparent fashion? These are major questions that I hope you consider as you choose to develop technology, because I really do believe that our world depends on it. And I know that sounds a little Orwellian, but I really do believe it depends on it. So, conversation, questions, thoughts?
One thing about regulation I think is important is that experts should be the people regulating, not like uh, for example, when Mark Zuckerberg was interviewed in Congress, most of those people don't even know about computers more than opening up their email and like maybe Facebook. So it should be experts who know how this stuff works who do the regulation.
I agree with that. How do you think that you reconcile, like kind of like what it's saying in the video, these choices, they affect everybody, because whether or not you're the developer or you're the person on the other side of the screen, how do you reconcile what people are willing to tolerate and then what experts believe in and think is right? How do you reconcile those two is the question.
Right.
I think it's interesting, but I agree with you. I think experts should be, because if you just decide to regulate something and you don't, out of fear, you're not constructively, choosing what is right and what is wrong, and what should we entertain. Rather, you're just legislating out of fear. I agree with that.
And Kai just asked, are there some areas where AI should not be used at all?
I think so. Ultimately, that question is out kind of for everybody to consider right now. That's a big thing that's being questioned. I really don't think that AI should be used in the judicial system.
Yeah.
I don't think it should be used in. Should it be used by the government in surveillance activities? Yeah, maybe. But how is it used? Should it be used by banks and financial services? Maybe, but how is it used? I think there's places where, yeah, it's an absolute no, and I think there's places where it's a little more gray. What do you guys think?
I mean, you got to look at what the situation is without AI regardless. Because, like, for example, with the bank example, okay, you take out AI, but people are still biased. So you're really fixing anything, moving AI from the system.
Yeah.
Michael, you, Kai, anyone else?
I think you covered most of it, Greg.
I think it's a really interesting topic. I like to think about it because I'm a kind of philosophy guy. I like to think about the big questions. This is a really, this goes at a lot of levels. It goes. Say again?
It's important to consider in any field that you go into, like you said.
Right.
Yeah, you talk about AI taking jobs. You're talking about like what the purpose of our existence has been. Like,
I know, right?
It gets crazy once you talk about that sort of stuff.
Isn't that crazy how it can connect to something so big, but then it can also be as nuanced as understanding the data set and what are its biases. That's it's crazy interesting to me.
So I guess our biggest takeaway should be to consider the data that you put in, and also consider the context of where you're using your program.
Oh yeah, for sure. Okay, cool.
All right, well.
Thanks for the
I'm gonna
presentation.
share this with all you guys.